First off, just thanks very much to Stefan and the University of Southampton. So I think today's been absolutely brilliant, but also for inviting me to take part. So what I'm going to focus on today is just a little bit about how I became a podcaster. So this is a relatively new journey for me. I guess I released my first episodes on April 29th of this year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to that position, and then talk a little bit about some of the things that I've learnt along the way that hopefully will be of use. And also thanks Dave for the last presentation, because I thought it was fantastic. So in terms of what I did previously, so my role, I've got 9 years experience in events, and my role prior to this was head of content for Bett. So Bett is a large education technology event. It's about education innovation and welcomes 36,000 attendees every year, and I was responsible for the content delivery. So I had a team, and I was charged with understanding what those audiences from early years right up to higher education wanted to hear about, who were the most compelling speakers in those areas. And in terms of higher education, these were some of the organisations that took part. So University of Southampton, and then various speakers around sort of how higher education is being disrupted by online players, MOOCs, etc. So then in 2014, this happened, and I was starting to already think about 9 years in events. Did I want to sit there in another 9 years and say that's what I had done? And it was very all-encompassing. So I was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, oh my God, I need to do this for the French Ministry of Education, and that wasn't that sustainable. But also, whilst I was on maternity leave, I was using podcasts as a mechanism to maintain my understanding of the Edtech sector, hence the old earphones there. But what I found was that predominantly from a global overview point of view, the podcast that was available in this area and that I was using was EdSurge, and which is a fantastic podcast, but it's very much based and rooted in the States. So in terms of there being one based in the UK with a global overview, that remained to be seen. And I was listening to podcasts like TES, so they're very, it's a fantastic podcast. It looks at the education landscape week to week, obviously drawing on its articles of that week. But again, not sort of specialised in the area that I was focused on. And I think they also have a higher education podcast. At the same time, I was starting to think about the rise of the podcast medium. And again, most of these figures from Edison Research, which are always quoted, are based around the States predominantly, but just some other ones there. I mean, we've talked about Serial and what makes podcasting sexy, but it definitely had a kind of impact on people's sort of mainstream knowledge of podcasts. And in terms of the UK, these are a couple of years old now, but there's a significant amount of the population that with the rise of sort of mobility and commuting are using podcasts to either for enjoyment or for professional development and that kind of thing. At the same time, this phenomenon is happening. So Harvard Business School have termed this the rise of the super temp. So people's working styles and sort of work career patterns, I suppose, are changing as well. So in the States, there's a huge shift towards independent working, and that's also happening here slightly behind what's happening in the States. And my expectations of work were changing. Bett was based in Paddington. I live in Hackney Wick. It's the kind of being chained to your desk type thing. I wanted to get back into these new ways of content creation and actually the innovative side of it. So I also thought about who I knew, and so I started to think about these questions, and my husband sort of reminded me about some of the people that we knew, and one of our mutual friends is a really good sound engineer. I realised that I didn't remember this because I was probably far too drunk, but Martin was at a wedding that I went to, and my husband reminded me of this, and I thought it was a great chance to go and have a conversation and basically express my interest in this medium and get some feedback. And then at the same time, I was sort of thinking about, oh, hang on, I've got all of these, I'm not an educator, I'm not a teacher, I'm not a lecturer, but I have this raft of really amazing contacts and people with incredible stories, and also best practice and lessons to share with the audience that I wanted to develop. And on top of that, really weird coincidences start to happen when you start doing podcasting. So I suddenly realised UK podcasters who are here and who have spoken were based in the Isle of Wight. I'm from the Isle of Wight. I realised that Joe Dale, who was in my sort of network on Twitter, is again based on the Isle of Wight. So we did a podcast together, and strangely enough, he replaced my French teacher at school. I didn't know this beforehand. And a recent interview I did with Dr. Rose Lukin at UCL Knowledge Lab threw up the fact that she was at the University of Sussex in the Vice Dean's team, or Vice Chancellor's team, sorry, whilst I was a student there, and there was one occasion where they were going to knock down a building which Radiohead had played in, and the students were so up in arms about this that they got all of the soil from this construction site and dumped it outside the Vice Chancellor's office, whilst Dr. Rose Lukin was inside, which we worked out whilst I was doing the podcast interview with her. And I definitely wasn't involved in that, but I was there to witness it. So yeah, all these strange things happen. So began Operation Secret Squirrel. So I'm still in my full-time role, but I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning one day at my mother-in-law's house, went downstairs and just started like reeling out all of these social media accounts. So I think that's Skype, and you'll see that's joined in February 2006. I launched it in April. Facebook page, just trying to work out what there's, Instagram. And I joined I thought, right, I'm going to at least have a little bit of a background here, and I went on a £50 Guardian masterclass. And this was run by the producer of the Guardian football podcast Weekly, Ben Green. And that was really good. And I think, like today, the main thing was it wasn't necessarily about finding out about the kit or anything else. It was about being in a room of people that had the same ambitions, you know, had the same questions and could connect, and you knew that they were going to go off and do this, and it gave you the kind of final push to go and do it yourself. I went, having been on this course, I went off and bought some kit, which he recommended, and to be honest, I felt that this person's done all the research, you know, you could spend hours and hours looking at different kit, and I would completely agree with Dave and others that have spoken today that it's not, you know, there is a whole raft of different ways of doing it, but yeah, so it's just kind of doing it. But this is kind of what I ended up going off and buying. And then I spent a week during my week of my birthday in Glastonbury, not at the festival, basically practicing. So just, you know, setting it up, having a play on Audacity. In the daytime, we're hanging out with my son. He'd go to sleep, and then we'd do like 3 or 4 hours with my husband, not like that, just doing podcasting. And yeah, so in the end, in terms of editing, I use Audacity, and we can come on to why in a minute. In terms of hosting, I use Libsyn, and in terms of distribution, iTunes is one of the main channels. So I then, in terms of how I went about it, I live in Hackney, so it was very convenient for me to set up interviews locally whilst I was still working. So I focused the first series on Hackney, and you've got this amazing story of a turnaround from some of the most abysmal educational results in the borough to absolutely fantastic now. And then at the same time, you've got all of these tech innovation companies coming into the borough, and to what extent were they connecting, collaborating or not. So I did an interview with the then principal of Hackney Community College, with the CEO of Here East, which is a sort of maker space, creative space in the Olympic Broadcasting Centre, and with Jeremy from the Hackney Learning Trust. And Ian's now gone on to head up the Association of Colleges, so further education. I got to my last day at Bett, and I wrote this email which basically said, you know, to all of the speakers that I had worked with and associations and so on, thank you very, very much. Over that weekend before, I'd worked like ridiculously to get 3 episodes up on Libsyn and kind of latent, and then I sent that out, and I left the office, and those 3 episodes were already up. So then this happened. It wasn't quite this dramatic, but I did quit my job. And, that was both extremely exhilarating, but also quite, nerve-wracking in that way. But, it's exciting, and I could feel that there's some kind of momentum happening, and, it's interesting. So current situation is I'm now on episode 26 of the podcast. It's been on iTunes New and Noteworthy. It's had 13,000 downloads in 4 months, so it's yet to tip over that. It's still a very niche topic, but regular listenership, and interesting for me, it is global. That's something I aspired for it to be, not to be a kind of just domestic podcast, with China being number 4 audience. So just moving on to setup. So this is just kind of what I use. You can, I find it quite useful for someone to just go, this is what I bought, and this is where I bought it from, and this is how much it cost. But like I said, you can take your iPhone out of your pocket and do something differently. But so in terms of the microphone that I asked my interviewee, so it's an interview format to record into, it's this one. It comes with a pair of half-decent headphones. Then I use a Zoom H6 recorder. Again, it's adjustable, it gives you a bit of flexibility if you do decide to do things like panels. So each of those sides there, you've got like the option to have 4 microphones come out of that, and the sound's very good. But I would agree that I like the texture of having things happen in the background. So I did a quick podcast recording earlier with Kelly Long, and we were talking about different background noises that we've had. So recently we've had like a baby crying, had sort of sirens in central London, and I think as long as it's not for an intense amount of time, I quite like that. As long as you note it when you sort of tee up your audience as well. You don't need this many, but if you use this kit, you will need one of these cables to connect the microphone to the recorder. And then this is a bit of kit that I really like. It basically just goes straight into your smartphone, and it's a little lapel mic, and it means that if you use the recording option on your actual smartphone, that it just gives you a slightly better sound quality to play with. But it's just really durable, and what I like to use it for is if I'm on the way somewhere and I'm sort of talking about who I'm going to interview, and again, you can capture. So I did a quick intro into the head of digital programs at the V&A, and I was in their sort of cafe, and it's quite cavernous in that way. So it's quite nice to sort of capture some of the journey that you're going on as well. I don't remember it being that expensive, so shop around. That's my advice. And then additional, so you will want batteries if you're out and about. You might want windshields for your extra microphone. I started off with a mic stand, but I actually find it too formal now. So if you put a stand there and you're fiddling around with it, and also people tend to not then speak into the microphone as much as they might if they're just holding that and they're in control of how they're speaking, and it feels a bit too much like a webinar or something like that. So I kind of disbanded with that quite early on. In terms of editing, I use Audacity. I started with Audacity, and I'm sure it's one of those things where you start and then you just get familiar with the platform and you tend to stick with it. You could use GarageBand, you could use a whole raft of different things. Once you tinker around with it, and there's some great videos on YouTube, it is quite easy to use, and it is free, which is a massive bonus. Then you've got, in terms of hosting, I use Libsyn. It's not a platform that's likely to fall over, as far as I can tell, in the near future. If you are thinking about either demonstrating, if you've got budget signed off this and you need to demonstrate back to your faculty, well, what's the value of this? It has got good analytics, so that could be either for your faculty, it could be for if you're going down a kind of ad route later on. I've put payment options. What I mean by that is the actual cost to host on it starts really low. So I think it's like $5. I think I use one that's $19, and that gives you the analytics. And they're very good at getting back to you quite quickly as well. And then in terms of distribution, the iTunes store or App Store, Podcast Store even, still has the lion's share. So whilst Android have the lion's share of smartphones, Apple still dominate podcast distribution at the moment and search. That will change, I believe, but it's worth bearing in mind in the sort of short term. So what I would recommend is that you definitely get your podcast on iTunes if you're searching for a broad audience, and then on a range of Android platforms as well. But I think the most important is actually your specialist audience channels. So what I think is amazing about this event and everyone here today is that you'll probably be only some of the very few people on the planet that can deliver that content that you have specialist knowledge of. So that's an amazing asset. So just getting it out there is already incredible and will be of huge value to your particular audience. So thinking about, what publications do those listeners read into, what associations do they work with, and that kind of thing. So in that front, or on that front, these are some of the people that I work with. So each person that would come on the podcast, I obviously ask them to distribute it. I ask if they're associated with any other organisations to distribute it. And then I work with various media publications to develop contra partnerships so that they also push those out. So for example, UK Education Weekly is a media publication that serves the independent schools across China. So I basically repurpose the podcast interview into a written form, and then they would give the byline to the Edtech Podcast, which gives you new listeners. Innovate My School, same kind of thing. I've been speaking to them, they're actually developing a podcast website as a result, a podcast page, sorry. So obviously it's great for them, they get new readers to their website, but I get new downloads because they have 20,000 people on their database. Education Technology the same. And then also thinking about the main events in this space. So I'm sure you have specialist events as well. So these guys have like crazy databases and reach in terms of internationally as well. So it depends what your objectives are. If your objectives are not to go large in terms of distribution, this isn't relevant, but it may be that there's an event where there's 50 people that are exactly the right type of people that will benefit from this. So it's just thinking about what those are. And then again, iTunes. I also use LinkedIn, so I have about 3,000 followers on LinkedIn, and I make sure that when the podcast comes out, I put the show notes onto SlideShare, and then create a post on LinkedIn and make sure that goes in all of the groups across LinkedIn that are interested in education technology. And then Twitter as well. So on Twitter, certainly in education, I know in higher education you've got things like LTHE chat, you've got Alt-C. There are specific communities and Twitter chats that are happening every day, every week. So tapping into when those are happening and making sure that you're adding value to the conversation. So you're not just spamming like your link, but that you're engaging in the communities. And then if you are going to post a link and it's more direct in that way, do it either slightly before the Twitter chat's going to happen or slightly afterwards. So this is an example of a sort of newsletter that Education Technology sent out, and they've got a link to the CEO of JISC interview, and it gives a link to the podcast. And this is EdTech Asia, an event that it's taking place in a couple of weeks, I think, and I'm acting as sort of media partner with them because we share a similar audience. Just as a couple of examples, as Joe down the top left there, and so this is just as well, again, just to demonstrate some of the interaction that you have on Twitter and the value of not just siloing your work in terms of it going onto iTunes and that's it. It's what happens after it's gone out, and just making sure you're interacting with these people as well. And this is an example of, during a week, some of the Twitter chats that are happening, and then thinking about, so what I've done is where they're US based, interpret that back into what time is that in the UK as well, so that you know that if you're posting there, then in the US it's the right time, etc. And thinking about what goes out each week as well. So I also now add on things like, rate and review or subscribe, because, if you don't, as long as you're not doing it, overkill, then I think those are good messages to remind people just to kind of, keep the retention of your audience in that way. And then this is an example email that goes out to a sort of weekly distribution list that I've built up with those associations and events and people that would be interested in giving the link or distributing the link to a wider audience as well. And these are some examples of where I've either repurposed the interview into written form and then posted that. That one's on LinkedIn and that's on Education Technology again. I'd like to invite you all to the Edtech Podcast launch party if you're interested and you want to find out a bit more. The podcast, what I do is it covers education innovation. So new practices. I spoke to the students at the front here. They talk about digital literacy. So it's basically about that and about what Stefan does and how it's applied from early years right up to higher education, but with all stakeholders in mind. So educators, but also investors, startups, government, association, the whole raft, because I think at the moment the ed and the tech aren't really talking the same language, and I think in terms of innovation it would happen faster if that dialogue was strengthened through reminding people that there are humans on both sides. That's the idea, but this is happening at Loughborough University London in the Olympic Park, and it's on Eventbrite, and I'll send around the link, but it'd be great to have you there. And then I'd like to just sort of end on why is this relevant to you? So, it does take a long time, whichever format you do it in, but why would you dedicate that? And I think this is even more important given the sort of recent circumstances. There's a Canadian academic called Dave Cormier, and he's all about rhizomatic learning and about the value of distributing your ideas, but beyond the kind of journal publication model. And he talks about sort of rockstar academics on Twitter and that kind of thing. But the idea is that it's more networked. And so I think some of the positives for this are whatever research you're delivering, it can make your ideas potentially more robust because you're sense testing that with a lot of people quite quickly through your networks and through the podcast, but also through the social media conversations afterwards. It allows you to connect internationally as well. So if you're building up that listener base beyond your physical presence at a university, then again, that's giving you international opportunity where perhaps some other doors are closing at the moment. It also means that you can kind of lead on some of those discussions. So rather than being passive in that sense, so many people could go out and do a podcast. It's incredible just actually being the person that goes out and does that, because what will happen is really interesting conversations will come your way as a result. And I think in terms of getting your ideas into the public domain, it will mean that you can have more presence in the media, and again, it doesn't have to mean being on Radio 4, or it can just mean that in terms of your sector specific media as well, via events such as this one and being hosted on relevant websites. So someone mentioned earlier on about sort of SEO search and searching through Google. Well, I think that actually this kind of activity will really kind of mean that your research is given a bit more exposure in that way. So just some extra resources to finish on. So Ben Green is the producer that I mentioned. He has a Kindle book, ebook, which is I think like £3. It's quite good just as an overview. It covers like the whole raft of from kit, interview techniques. It's quite a good starting point. Again, podcasters support group. So Martin is at the back. Martin and Helen, I believe, run this maybe with some friends. Semi. Yeah, it's a collaborative effort. It's a rhizomatic effort, but it's really great because it's a very active group. So if you post a question there, within probably 3 minutes, 5 people will have replied to you with quite a good deal of expertise, and it's been going for a while. So even if it means just pointing you in the direction of a feed that happened before, and again, I'm going to hopefully go to the event that's happening in King's Cross. This is an American guy. He runs YouTube sort of videos, and he has his own podcast, and they can get quite granular, I find, but at the same time, I have found them extremely useful if you're looking for a solution to a particular problem. And then New Media Europe. So the guys here, again, they run an event and sort of have a huge expertise in this sort of new medium and questions, and I believe also have a Facebook group in this area, so definitely check them out. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?